Hello everyone. Thank you for attending today's Watershed webinar, Wastewater Treatment and its Impact on the Chesapeake Bay. Our presenter is Dr. Benjamin Roman, Postdoctoral Fellow of Environmental Engineering at St. Francis University.
So I gave a talk, one of these talks maybe a year ago now, but just to reintroduce myself, my name is Ben Roman. I'm a postdoctoral fellow in environmental engineering here at St. Francis University. I did my PhD at Penn State in environmental engineering, and my expertise is really within wastewater treatment. So I could talk about this topic for much longer and much deeper than the hour that I'm going to here. So if you have any additional questions or anything, I'm happy to follow up with you about that. All right, so wastewater is essentially the water that has been used by a community and has then been sent back to a wastewater treatment plant. So this schematic or this picture on the right here, I'm not sure if can you see my mouse? I'm trying to. Yeah. All right, there, I got my laser pointer now. So on the figure on the left here, it's showing kind of an urban water cycle, but this is relevant for rural areas also, where typically you have a stream or a river that is coming from some mountainous area and it ends up in some reservoir, lake, pond, anything like that. But typically water is pumped out of that water source, or it could come from groundwater also. It's pumped through a water treatment plant, which makes it suitable for us to drink or consume. It usually goes to these water towers, which I'm sure you've all seen, that provides pressure to send the water out to the community. And then once that water has been used by the community by either households or commercials or industry, it is sent then to a wastewater treatment plant, where there's a bunch of things that go on in there to clean up the water. And then that water is then sent back to typically the same water source that the water treatment was coming from. So you have this kind of closed loop cycle where we're taking water out of the environment, we're using it, polluting it, cleaning it, and then putting it back in the environment. And this figure on the right here is showing one way that these are designed. So you can have sewage systems that are combined with stormwater. And that's what this is showing, where you have the grates on the street that are collecting rainwater are going directly into the sewage plant. So some communities, some cities are designed this way, others are not, where they have stormwater and sewage separate. But from my knowledge, the northeastern United States, since it is an older part of the United States, they have a lot of these combined systems versus the West Coast, where those civilizations were being built kind of in later years. So this combined system was phased out, but a lot of cities and areas around this part of the world still have these combined sewer storm systems. And that'll be important in the later slide. So the ultimate goal of wastewater treatment is to protect public and environmental health. So if wastewater is left untreated, there are contaminants in it that can cause these public health risks or environmental health risks. One of those contaminants is nutrients. So nitrogen and phosphorus are the big ones in wastewater. Urine is a nitrogen-based organic chemical. So nitrogen and phosphorus are one of the main things that we're trying to remove in these wastewater treatment systems. If we don't do that, you can have, due to nutrient release, algal blooms, which is known as eutrophication. When this happens, algae forms on a lake or a reservoir. It dies. The bacteria consume all that dead algae. And when they do that, they're consuming oxygen in the water. When that happens, the other aquatic life can't live in that water. So you have like fish deaths or oysters that die off, which is not good, right? We don't want all of our fish dying. And then also nitrogen in drinking water can cause this thing called blue baby syndrome, which is pretty scary, but essentially baby skins will turn blue, and it's due to a lack of oxygen in their blood. So if you have a water source that is highly polluted by nitrogen and your water treatment plant is taking that water to send to a city, you can have issues with nitrogen for public health. There's also pathogens. So, in our gut, there's a bunch of these viruses, diseases, bacteria, E. coli, salmonella, that can cause public health issues. There's also organic matter. So these are carbon-based materials, like from human waste, paper products, detergents, or foods. Anything that could go down your drain that has a carbon basis is organic. And if that's left untreated, it gets really stinky and goes septic and smells like that rotten egg smell. And it can also produce different gases that may be explosive or actually like harmful to your health. There's also chemicals, so detergents, all of the cleansers that you're using in your households that will go down the drain, and they can cause issues with environmental and public health also. And then finally, pharmaceuticals. So this is sort of a newer area of study where we're starting to see that a lot of these drugs that we're taking in hormones that are coming out of us in our urine are not well removed in our wastewater treatment plants. And then they're accumulating in the environment. And there hasn't really been a solid conclusion about this yet, but it's an ongoing area of concern. And we're seeing some strange things happen to like amphibians that live in these ecosystems that are being polluted by pharmaceuticals, where they're going through weird reproductive changes and things like that. So it's a little concerning, and it's a really big focus of research in wastewater right now. But there currently aren't like regulations for pharmaceutical removals, but that probably is coming. All right, so I'm going to kind of tell a little history of wastewater in the United States in these next few slides. So prior to like the 1900s, wastewater treatment was typically done on site. You'd either have like a septic tank and a drainage field on your property that you would use. And then as civilization started to grow and cities started to form, we realized that this was no longer going to be good enough. We didn't have the land area to treat our wastewater anymore. So in the early 1900s, we started to create what we know as today as wastewater treatment. And it was really largely unchanged until like the mid 1970s. And the early objective was to remove suspended and floatable materials, and also the treatment of these biodegradable organics. So that organic matter that I said would smell really bad if we left it untreated. And also elimination of pathogens. So this figure here on the right shows what would happen if you let raw wastewater or a water that has a lot of biodegradable organics in it into a natural system. So here you kind of have like the natural state where there's high dissolved oxygen and low what we call biochemical oxygen demand. So this is also known as BOD. You might hear me refer to that term BOD as I talk. And it's essentially just a measure of the amount of organics in a water. We call it oxygen demand because those organics will take oxygen out of the water due to microbial metabolisms. But what happens is if you get this really dirty organic rich water in a natural system, the oxygen will deplete very quickly due to microbial activity. So the microbes are in there eating all this organic matter, and when they do that, they're using oxygen as an electron acceptor. I say they breathe, but they don't. So they're like us, they consume organics, they breathe oxygen. That's how they get their energy. So they're removing oxygen from the water. And when that happens, there's no other life can live. All the fish are no longer present. So we don't want this. This is bad. And this is one of the main reasons we started treating wastewater. Another one is to try to get rid of pathogens. So a lot of this has to do with water treatment too. So we started chlorinating water around the same time that we started treating wastewater too, which is accounting for this decline in typhoid fever. So this is showing incidents per 100,000 people in the United States from 1920 to 1960. And you can see that those incidents basically have been eradicated. And that's largely due to environmental engineering and wastewater treatment and water treatment. So there's a talk that I saw a few years ago that I thought was clever, where it's like, the title was, if you live to be older than 60 years old, don't thank a doctor, thank an engineer. Because these types of things are what really increased our life expectancy. Not that the medical field doesn't either. So these objectives were not uniformly met through the United States well into the 1980s. So pretty recently, within the past 30 or 40 years, wastewater treatment wasn't, across the board how it is today. It's still a relatively like new infrastructure. And because of that, many of these plants that were originally built are still being operated today because it's only been 40 or 50 years since then. All right, so wastewater treatment is accomplished by providing oxygen to these bacteria in a confined tank of water. So we're essentially just letting what would happen naturally in the environment, like this figure here, but we're confining it in a concrete tank. and we're making it really efficient. And we do that by pumping in air. So we're just providing oxygen to the bacteria that are in this tank. And if they have a bunch of organics and a bunch of oxygen, then they're going to oxidize or consume that organic matter. And that's kind of what I'm showing in this figure here, where you have the green circle is the bacteria, organics are your brown, and white are your oxygen. So they'll consume that organic matter and that oxygen. So then your water is being cleaned. But if you don't provide oxygen, they'll stop doing this. So that's why we pump air into here to make that really efficient. And we call this activated sludge, which I personally think is a really silly name. But yeah, I just thought I'd point that out because you may hear somebody talk about activated sludge in a wastewater treatment plant. But really all it is a bunch of bacteria living in a tank where we provide oxygen. And this is kind of the general reaction where you have organic matter plus nutrients plus oxygen plus bacteria goes to more bacteria. Carbon dioxide, nitrogen gas, and water. These are the end products of this reaction. All right, so I apologize for the amount of text on this slide. If one of my students showed me this, I would tell them you can never present this. But when I talk about regulations, I don't know how else to talk about it without showing text. So in the 1970s, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency was established, and this allowed the federal government to start applying regulations to wastewater treatment plants. So specifically in 1972, the Clean Water Act was passed, and it provided federal regulations for the removal of specifically organic matter, so biochemical oxygen demand, total suspended solids, so just the amount of settlable material in the water, and then pH. So they all had to be below a certain concentration on a 30-day average, and pH has to be within 6 and 9 at all times. So 1972 is the first time that we had federally given some effluent regulations to these wastewater treatment plants. In the past, they could be discharging whatever they wanted. But it wasn't until 1987 when the Water Quality Act passed, which was the first major revision of this Clean Water Act. And really, it provided the EPA or the federal government more power to kind of fine or enforce these discharge violations. So I like to, when I present this to my students, that it provided the bill some teeth, like this stupid picture of a duck with teeth, just because regulations are boring and I try to make it fun. So yeah, Clean Water Act 1972 sent regulations for organic matter. 1987, we had another act that kind of provided more power to these regulatory agencies. And then finally, in 2002, there was the Total Maximum Daily Load program. And this looked at more specific to site standards. So, these were general concentrations, but these TMDL programs started looking at specific sites where we looked at the amount of organic matter or nitrogen or phosphorus that we had to remove on a loading basis. So a loading basis would be like mass per time, where these are concentrations. So this, you could have a plant that is tiny, right? It's only treating 5 houses of wastewater. And if it has above 30 milligrams per liter of BOD, it's probably not a huge problem because the volume of water coming out of there is so tiny. Versus if you have, a major city that is discharging 30 milligrams per liter, but their flow rate's so high that it's having a bigger impact on the environment as a whole. So that's kind of what this Total Maximum Daily Load program did, is it started more holistically looking at wastewater treatment systems and how we can regulate them. All right, so I think we have our first poll question now. So the question is, what pollutant causes algal blooms in a process known as eutrophication, which I covered briefly in a previous slide. All right, we got some mixed results. So the answer is nutrients. Good job to the 40% of you that picked that. So yeah, these algal blooms, typically when they occur, it's because they're limited by nitrogen or phosphorus in the water. So clean water, right, won't cause algal blooms because there aren't enough nutrients in it for the algae to grow to it a really high extent. So that's what's the limiting factor. And that's one of the major issues currently going on in the Chesapeake Bay, is they have a lot of nutrients entering them, causing these algal blooms and then lowering the dissolved oxygen. All right. So I kind of explained that a little more here. So nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus in excess can cause these algal blooms that lead to eutrophication. And I explained this pretty quickly, so I'll go through it again. Essentially what happens is you have nutrients that end up in a water system, okay? When that happens, algae is really happy. It starts growing really fast and it starts to basically cover the entire surface of this water. When that happens, it blocks out the sun. So these submerged grasses can no longer grow because they're not getting, you know, the sunlight that they need. When that happens, they die. And also this algae, as it's growing, it's going to start to die and settle down to the bottom of the water body also. So that's what this is showing here. So when you have all of this kind of dead plant material, it's a bunch of organic matter. The bacteria in there are going to want to eat up that organic matter. And when they do that, they deplete the oxygen, right? Because they're consuming their oxygen, they're consuming the organic matter. That's how they reproduce. And yeah, that kills the ecosystem. When the oxygen levels deplete below a certain level, all the fish and all the other aquatic life can't live. So that is eutrophication. It's similar to what I showed before with the organic matter going into the stream and the oxygen level dropping. But there's kind of like this pre-step where you have algae blooming and then dying, and then that dead algae is the organic matter. And this, you know, this is what that looks like. So this is the coast of New Jersey and New York here in the summer of, I think, 2021. So you can kind of see this massive algal bloom that's forming here in the Atlantic Ocean. And likely, you know, you can almost see like New York City sitting right here. There's kind of this like swirl coming out. Like, I wonder if that's the effluent from the wastewater treatment plant from New York City, you know, that's causing all of this excess nutrients where these algal are blooming. So, you know, this is a huge scale that we're causing these algal blooms, but also on smaller scales, you can see that too. And, you know, the dead fish in a eutrophic stream here. All right, so because of all these issues with eutrophication in across the globe, really, but in the Chesapeake Bay is really a hot spot for it. There are increasingly stringent regulations for specifically nutrient removal. And again, you know, up until the 1980s, conventional wastewater treatment focused primarily on the removal of organic matter and suspended solids, not nutrients. So a lot of these plants that were built, you know, around this time were not designed to remove nutrients. That wasn't part of what we were trying to accomplish at that point. But in 2010, the US EPA established this Chesapeake Bay cleanup plan, and it even further limited the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus that these wastewater treatment facilities could discharge in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So we don't have federal regulations across the board for nitrogen and phosphorus like we do for spittle suspended solids and organics, because certain watersheds are more sensitive to nutrients. So the Chesapeake Bay is a very sensitive watershed. So our effluent regulations are pretty stringent in this area because of that. So if you have a wastewater treatment plant that's in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, your discharge limits are probably going to be more stringent than if you lived in Pittsburgh and you're discharging to the Mississippi River. So because of that, these facilities are being upgraded to include what is known as biological nutrient removal. And it requires, I'll talk more about it, but it requires upgrades to these facilities. So just to kind of bring it in perspective, in 2020, wastewater accounted for 11% of the total nitrogen pollution and 15% of the total phosphorus pollution to the Chesapeake Bay. So it's not the largest polluter. Agriculture actually is the largest polluter, but I think it's like tied for second. So it's still a substantial amount of nitrogen and phosphorus that we're polluting to the Chesapeake Bay from, you know, the effluent of these wastewater treatment systems. So biological nutrient removal, it requires cycling the wastewater through aerobic and anaerobic or anoxic conditions. And what that just means is aerobic means there's oxygen in the water. Anaerobic and anoxic means there's no oxygen in the water. Excuse me. So if you look at this figure on the right here first, this is kind of like a normal schematic of a wastewater treatment system. So just this black part that I'm showing right here that says required for organic removal, this is that activated sludge, right? You have this aerobic treatment. So it's just a big concrete tank that we're pumping air into. And those bacteria are, you know, consuming all that organic material and oxygen, and it's cleaning the water. But in order to remove nitrogen, we have to cycle it between an aerobic and an anoxic or anaerobic stage. And the reason for that is this nitrogen cycle. So typically, raw wastewater is an ammonia base and a reduced form of nitrogen. So in order to get rid of that, we have to oxidize it to nitrate. So this requires oxygen in the water. And then after we form that nitrate, we need to reduce it again to nitrogen gas. So this is called nitrification. This is called denitrification. And these are two really important processes in wastewater treatment. And it's how we essentially remove nitrogen. We oxidize it to nitrate and then reduce it to nitrogen gas. And then that nitrogen gas is able to just volatilize out of the tanks. In the environment, or the atmosphere is like 80% nitrogen or something. So it's an inert, right? It's not like a greenhouse gas. But you can imagine, right? Like this process requires these treatment systems to build additional tanks, and that can be really expensive, especially, you know, if your wastewater treatment plant is confined by other things, right? Like a lot of these treatment systems are in a city or something. It's not like they have a bunch of land that they can just expand their treatment plant. So that's an issue for trying to upgrade existing plants. To get rid of phosphorus, and this slide I stole from my wastewater treatment class. I don't expect you to digest all of this. In fact, many of it I don't even want you to look at because they'll probably just be more confusing. But it's the same idea where in order to remove phosphorus biologically through these organisms called phosphorus accumulating organisms, or PAOs, we have to cycle the wastewater through these aerobic or anoxic and anaerobic stages. And it's known as this feast and famine is what they call it. So what happens is essentially these bacteria specifically can store phosphorus in their cells as like a backup battery. So if there's a lot of carbon around and a lot of phosphorus, they can store that phosphorus in their cells for when that carbon goes away, they can use that phosphorus as their energy source. So it's kind of like a way for these bacteria to have a competitive advantage over other types of bacteria. From like a evolutionary standpoint. But for us, it's useful because we can cycle them through this and there's a net intake of phosphorus. So we can remove phosphorus from the water by accumulating it in these bacteria, essentially. I hope that was clear enough without making your eyes glaze over by looking at this slide. Phosphorus can also be removed from wastewater using chemical treatment with iron or aluminum. So again, a lot of this might be too deep for what I want you to get, but phosphate, since it has a negative charge, it's an anion, it will electrostatically form with these positive cation metals, so like iron and aluminum. So you can add iron and aluminum to a wastewater or a water containing phosphate, and you can precipitate these minerals. So that's a way to remove it from the water because it will fall out into a sludge. It can also adsorb to iron and aluminum oxides. So the idea here is that, you know, if you add iron or aluminum to water, you can remove phosphate from its dissolved form. But that's also expensive, right? You have to buy these chemicals and add them to the wastewater. All right. So despite all of those efforts that we've been making for the past 40 years now, the loading that we're seeing to the Chesapeake Bay hasn't really improved. So this top figure is showing the nitrogen loads in millions of pounds. All right, so we're looking at like 300 million pounds of nitrogen that we're sending to the Chesapeake Bay every year in 1990, and then I think this was like 2018 or 2019. It hasn't really changed. And the same for phosphorus. There's certain years where we have these like giant spikes. It just sort of is all over the place. And because of that, this is what the Chesapeake Bay looks like, where the axis here, the legend is showing the dissolved oxygen concentration. So red meaning really low. They call those hypoxic waters. Basically anything under 2 milligrams per liter, you're getting to the point where like fish are going to start dying and not being able to live in that. And you can see, many of these upper reaches of the Chesapeake Bay are at that level where essentially no aquatic life can live in this portion of the Chesapeake Bay because of all these nutrients that we've been sending to them. All right, so second poll question. So due to climate change, the northeastern United States is expected to experience increases in storm events and precipitation. So true or false? All right, everybody got this one good. So yes, you are all familiar with climate change models apparently. So yeah, And really, the Northeast United States is sort of a unique spot, and these figures don't show up, but other figures that I've seen in the past do, where we're one of the only regions in the whole world that is expected to have increases in precipitation due to climate change. Like most of the world's going to experience drought or water stresses. And these figures are just showing the United States. So this one on the right is from the New York Times, where they are showing annual average precipitation in the last 30 years compared to the 20th century. So you can see, we're getting a lot, plus 4 inches more up here in the Chesapeake Bay area. And this figure is showing where flood risk is projected to rise fastest. So again, our risk of flooding or our risk of very large storm events are increasing. And the reason I'm pointing this out is because the nutrient loading that the Chesapeake Bay or any watershed is going to receive is going to be really influenced by the amount of water that falls on that watershed, right? Like as rain falls, that's what's really picking up these nutrients and carrying them to the Chesapeake Bay. Maybe not so much from wastewater treatment effluents. That's pretty much always consistent, but from agriculture, really, I think is the big thing, where you can have these large storm events that can take nutrients from land and transfer them into waterways. So yeah, the overall goal of this slide is just to point out that likely into the future, our nutrient loading is going to increase as this precipitation and these rain is starting to increase. I got a chat, stormwater runoff. I don't know if that was recent or not. Yes, yeah, so exactly. I mentioned this combined systems, right? So if you have a bunch of rain falling, you can get these sewer overflow events. And I think that's a good segue to my next slide. Yeah, so as I mentioned previously, many of these systems are combined sewer and storm. So if you have more increased rain or more large storm events that are going to put stress on these sewer systems, you're going to have more events where you have these overflow events. So the way these are designed typically is you have this like kind of dam that sits here, and when under normal conditions, the wastewater can just come and go down and head off to the treatment plant. But under really high flow conditions, we put this kind of overflow pipe. And sometimes these are at the wastewater treatment plant, sometimes these are elsewhere, that will just kind of bypass the wastewater treatment altogether. And the reason we do this is because those activated sludge tanks that I talked about before, we spend a lot of time and effort to keep the concentration of bacteria really high in there. We want a lot of bacteria in there because there's the ones that are doing the treatment for us. So if we let all this flow go to our wastewater treatment plant, we can actually wash out that bacteria. If you have so much flow coming in your plant, you can kind of like dilute your activated sludge tank so that your bacteria levels drop so low that your treatment then is pretty much screwed. And it can take months sometimes to re-establish those microbial communities. So wastewater treatment plants really try to avoid that. And this is why, or this is how they do that. So this is just a video that actually is from I have to. So this is from Hollidaysburg, which is very close to St. Francis. Here is their wastewater treatment plant. And this is during Hurricane Ida in September 2021. So you can see like the stream that they discharge into is kind of just engulfed the entire wastewater treatment plant. And you can imagine, right, like this water is just kind of carrying raw wastewater with it down the stream. So it's pretty gross. And I'm gonna let this video play a little longer just because I think it's funny to see someone that is very brave drive through this. Yeah, so here's the wastewater treatment plant. Here's the water flowing. We all know what's coming out of there and flowing in this water, right? This guy said, whatever, I'm going to drive right through it. So he's driving through, pretty diluted wastewater right now, probably. And yeah, that's pretty much all I wanted to show you from this video. But yeah, there's another good image here where you can see the treatment plant there and then kind of the stream that has just engulfed it. And this is common, not just in the North United States, but all over the place where you have large storm events, these wastewater treatment plants can become kind of drowned or flooded with this water. And kind of just the basis of how we design wastewater treatment systems make them prone to flooding, because we usually want to put them low, right? Typically water treatment is elevated, wastewater treatment is in the lowest point, so that we can allow gravity to do our pumping for us, right? We put the water treatment high, gravity feeds it to the houses then feed it to the wastewater treatment plant. We don't have to have pumps there, we can just let gravity do that. So wastewater treatment plants are typically always like in a very low elevation in whatever community they're serving, which allows them to flood or makes them prone to flooding. And this is also becoming a really major issue in coastal cities because of sea level rise. So we know that sea level is rising due to climate change. Many of these coastal cities are discharging directly into the ocean. So as that ocean rises, their discharge pipe may start to become flooded, and it requires upgrades or changes to their facilities. All right, so many of the wastewater treatment systems in the Chesapeake Bay watershed do not meet nutrient discharge regulations. And this is, I'm just focusing on the Chesapeake Bay watershed for this talk, but this is true across the board. It's not just us in this region that we have like bad wastewater treatment or something. So in 2016, 21 sewage treatment plants in the Chesapeake Bay watershed violated their permits by releasing excess amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus. So I'm showing that there's 21 plants that violated, but really there were more than that. And they would have exceeded their limits if it were not for this pollution credit trading system that has been allowed. So I hope my bitterness doesn't show too much as I talk about this, but I really hate this idea. It's similar to like carbon credits, where a corporation can buy carbon credits that kind of offset the discharge or the emissions that corporation is doing. And in my opinion, it's a way for them to like guilt-free continue to pollute the earth, because they can buy a mangrove garden or something across the planet. But we also do this with nutrients. So like a wastewater treatment plant, if they are releasing a lot of nutrients, and there's another wastewater treatment plant, a watershed over that is well below their nutrient regulations, they can actually credit how below they are and then sell those to the wastewater treatment plant that is above, which is just ridiculous, I think. So what it does is it reduces transparency and accountability, and it contributes to local pollution hotspots where, you can have a wastewater treatment system that is just polluting an area really badly, but they're not being fined because they're buying pollution credits from over the hill or something. It's ridiculous. All right. So I'm going to go over 2 of these upgrades that are currently ongoing or have recently finished, and kind of show why these upgrades are not going as well as we expected to, or why the pollution of nitrogen and phosphorus to the bay hasn't really decreased even despite all these efforts. So there's a wastewater treatment plant in Baltimore called I'm assuming this is the city name, I'm gonna butcher it, so I won't even say it. It was constructed in 1940, okay, right? So this treatment plant is like coming on 100 years old now. It's treating 88 million gallons per day, so it's pretty big. It's the 2nd largest in Maryland. Its violation was it discharged more than 4 times its nitrogen limit in 2016. So 3.7 million pounds of nitrogen were released. And then because of this, the state fined the facility $5,000 in January and then $20,000 in May. So, these fines, $5,000 and $20,000 doesn't seem very extensive to me. I know that these facilities aren't like swimming in money, so it probably was a pretty big hit to their budget. But I don't know how much incentive this makes for like $1 million upgrades if you're only getting fined $5,000. So the EPA required them to complete their upgrades by 2014, but they weren't finished until January 2020. And they cite that the delay was because a court battle between contractors over defective pipe system designs and allegedly poor planning for the project. So, completely unrelated to like environmental health or anything. It's just a bunch of contractors that are arguing over some engineering system or something that, in any big construction project, you can have delays due to this, which is just sad and kind of the nature of these things. So the second one is also in Maryland. It was the Frederick wastewater treatment plant. It was constructed in 1986. It's pretty small, so 8 million gallons per day. I wouldn't say it's small, but it's smaller than the one we just talked about. And it had a really long history of violations, discharging more than 2 times its nitrogen limit in 2016, but those went back decades. So the state fined the facility $1,600 in April. Again, that value is pretty low. This was in April 2015. The state required that the plant be completed by July 2011. So 4 years later, they finally got a fine. And delays were cited for, this upgrade was supposed to cost $45 million. And they had arguments about the size of the plant. So wastewater treatment is an interesting infrastructure because it's a ratepayer, right? So you and I are the ones that are paying for this wastewater treatment plant. You all have a sewage bill that you pay each month. The cost of the amount that you pay each month is calculated based on how much money it costs to operate this facility and how many people live in your community that's feeding this, right? So if you make the plant bigger, it's going to make your monthly sewage bill more expensive, even though it may have better treatment, right? So there's always this like kind of game between politicians and environmental regulatory agencies and communities about, we want to make wastewater treatment affordable, but we don't want it to not accomplish what it needs to. This place was also built on a former landfill, so that causes a bunch of issues with settleability of the ground and other maybe hazardous chemicals that could be stored under this. And then apparently there was also a lawsuit by a neighboring landowner. So I'm just trying to point out some of these things that can delay these wastewater treatment plant upgrades or engineering projects in general, I guess. Okay, so what can you do? The Chesapeake Bay Foundation is it's a really great organization, and they work with community partners across the Chesapeake Bay to try to restore the health of the bay. So in the 4th century since the explorations of Captain John Smith, the Chesapeake Bay has lost 50% of its forested shorelines, 80% of its underwater grasses, and more than 98% of its oysters. So this is the effects for the impacts of humans moving into an area. So in order to try to combat what we have done to this ecosystem, they're trying to restore native oysters. So oyster filters. Oysters are good for the ecosystem because they can filter pollutants out. So they're kind of like a natural way to clean the water. And they can remove nutrients, organics. They're really they're called filter feeders because what they do is the water flows through them and they filter out these pollutants. And they also can provide habitat for fish, crabs, and other bay species because they create these sort of oyster reefs. So there's a lot of work going on in introducing those. Another is restoring healthy and clean soils. So they call these things living shorelines. And it's essentially taking shorelines across the bay and trying to reintroduce the natural habitat. So making, native wetland plants and grasses that prevent erosion, capture sediment. They filter pollution, but they also create habitat for wildlife. And then finally, tree planting. So there's a lot of tree planting efforts that go on in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And this is along rivers or waterways and in urban communities. And again, trees, they're a big part of riparian buffers. They're a natural way that we can filter or clean water before it enters our waterways. And they also help reduce heat and cool streams, which is important for some fish and aquatic species. Okay, so if you go to ChesapeakeBay.net, which is the Chesapeake Bay Foundation's homepage, they have this interactive map that shows there's over 600 regional groups that participate in similar restoration efforts in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So I think these numbers here, if you click on them, there's 206 right here that you could go to. So depending on where you're located, and if you're interested and want to get involved in any of these, you can find an organization probably pretty close by that does it. And most of them, as far as I know, are happy to accept volunteers. And they do events such as tree planting, trash pickups. Sometimes you even might be able to do some sampling and monitoring and educational outreach too. So I would imagine a lot of these would love to come to your high schools and give talks. So yeah, when you go to the homepage, you go to take action. there's Find a Bay organization that will bring you to this link. And then also under the Help Protect the Bay, in the same Take Action pad or tab, they provide 108 activities that you can kind of do, and a lot of these are actually like at school or in the classroom or in your backyard that you could potentially bring into the classroom with your students. If you decide that contacting a group and trying to meet up with another organization is too much, that you can probably find something in here that is related. And then also reach out to local universities. I would almost guarantee if there's a university nearby that has some sort of science program, that somebody there is doing something relating to the health of Chesapeake Bay, or it could be. And that it could be, more environmental engineering where you're looking at nutrients or whatever, or biology where you're looking at habitat. So just some examples here. This is these are some of our students working with Trout Unlimited, actually. So Trout Unlimited is just an organization that is about fishing, right? But they care about the health of the Chesapeake Bay watershed because they care about fish. So this is a picture of some of our students installing these erosion control structures in a stream. And here's one of our students at a local high school, so Bishop Guilfoyle, where they're doing some activities with high school students. Yeah, there's a tree planting event here, so you can see the green tubes that they're putting the trees in. Again, this is Dr. Tasker. He's one of our faculty in environmental engineering and some of the students there. So I think that's probably a good place to look if you're trying to get involved with this stuff and you're not sure where to turn. They may have some ideas too. Yeah, Blair County Conservation District is one that I'm familiar with too. We've done, one of our lab manager, Jim Eckenrode, I think he worked directly with them or maybe for them in his past life. So yeah, we've done a lot of work with a lot of these conservation districts or these watershed groups, and typically they're very happy to bring in volunteers. Could you provide the link to the resources mentioned? Yeah, sure. I can send that or link it in the chat. Is that the best way to do it?
Yeah, you can do that. And if you want to, I can send a follow-up email as well.
Okay, yeah, that works. Yeah, so that was my last slide. I'm happy to take any additional questions that you all have. And feel free to unmute, ask in the chat. Either way, I don't mind.
Well, thank you for giving this presentation as people think of questions here.
Yeah, of course, great. My pleasure.
Yeah.
So I sent the link there. If you go there, and then there's a tab, the third tab from the left called Take Action. And then that Help Protect the Bay and Find a Bay organization are the two that I referenced in my slides. So here at the university, is there any research related to watersheds, or specifically, I guess, wastewater, as the topic was, going on here, or any type of work with the local organization? Yeah, so we actually just finished a grant that was funded through the Office of Surface Mine Reclamation and Enforcement. So it had to deal with mine drainage, but our whole idea was, and it's kind of based on this slide here, was you could co-treat mine drainage with wastewater treatment with wastewater, because of this idea where these metals that would be present in mine drainage can remove phosphorus from the wastewater through this type of mechanism. And this is kind of like a cheap way to remove phosphorus with another waste stream without having to purchase or buy these chemicals. So that's, yeah, kind of one thing that the environmental engineering department here is doing about looking at phosphorus removal from wastewater in like an efficient or sustainable way in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. We also just submitted another grant where it's kind of related to this too, but because phosphate can be attenuated by all these metals, it's possible that these streams that have been impacted by mine drainage for decades have attenuated a lot of phosphorus in their sediment because of all these metals. So we're trying to explore if we treat a mine drainage source, are we going to release a bunch of bound phosphorus from sediment because we're removing that metal that it was previously attached to? And it's an area that's really relevant right now because recently the government passed this bill, BIL, and it has increased the amount of money that Pennsylvania has specifically for mine drainage treatment by like 10 times or something. Like it went from $25 million a year to $250 million a year. So there's going to be a lot of work remediating mine drainage. And because of that, we could introduce this new problem where we're now having a bunch of phosphorus that's being released from these watersheds because there's no longer metals that are attenuating it. So yeah, I think that covered it.
Do you foresee, like, in the future, is there any kind of like major improvements that could be made to the water treatment process, or are we kind of, there's pretty much everything is set as to, the efficiency of that?
Yeah. So wastewater treatment, I say I'm an expert in wastewater treatment, but really where my expertise lies is in alternative wastewater treatment. So the wastewater treatment that I described to you today is kind of conventional. And I don't think that it's the best way, in my personal opinion, that we could be dealing with nutrients. Those nutrients are valuable, right? So like I focus a lot on ecological wastewater treatment and trying to pull those nutrients out of wastewater so that we can use them for some beneficial purpose rather than converting them to nitrogen gas and sending them off into the atmosphere where we can't see them again for hundreds of years whenever some plant fixes nitrogen again. So I look at wastewater treatment in a much different way. I think it should be done on a more site-by-site basis, not having these like really large treatment facilities that are central and collecting millions of gallons. I think one of the solutions would be having like more segregated wastewater treatment systems that are smaller for like a city block or an apartment complex or something, rather than having these really, really large ones. And that can remove, issues with like flooding, where you have like a really big source and all your water's there. If it floods, then you're kind of screwed. Versus, if it's more segregated, then maybe you can stop that happening. So yeah, I don't know if I have a simple answer to that question. But yeah, we are, making improvements, but at the same time, I think there are things that are combating us, like climate change, like this issue with maybe phosphorus being released from these previously mine drainage impacted watersheds. It's really complex and we don't fully understand it.
Yeah, I think there's probably no small answer for that from the sounds of things. But, yeah. Awesome. Does anybody have any final questions here? Anything else you'd like to add, Ben?
I don't think so. Thank you all for showing up and your attention. I enjoy giving these talks.
Yeah, thank you for providing this information. And I should have mentioned that I don't think I did at the beginning that the NOAA BWET program is has provided funding to allow us to continue this project. So we're thankful to them. So thanks everybody. Have a nice afternoon.
See ya.